The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week, I'm pleased to have as my guest Ruly Carpenter, who was principal owner and president of the Philadelphia Phillies from 1972 to 1981. Ruly's tenure as owner was one of the most, if not the most, successful in franchise history. Between 1976 and 1980, the Phillies won their division in every season but one, including the team's first World Series win in 1980. They also won the first half of the National League East title in the strike-short 1981 season. After that season, Carpenter sold the Phillies to a group headed by longtime Phillies executive Bill Giles. Thanks for joining us, Ruly.
It's my pleasure.
I want to start with your father, Robert Carpenter Jr., who was 28 years old in November of 1943 when his father, your grandfather, purchased the Phillies and made your father the youngest club president in baseball history. He would serve as president of the Phillies until 1972, of course, when you succeeded him. Your father was a player's owner, a refreshing departure from the other more stodgy old MLB owners of the time. Tell us about him.
Well, my father, he was more of a football guy, actually, than baseball. He played football in college, and but he obviously loved baseball, and he was in the military when my grandfather purchased the Phillies in '43. And it was one of those, if you're fortunate enough to own the team, and be the president, it was great. I mean, he was very young, and there were a lot of things that had to be done, and there was a great pitcher, which a lot of people will recognize the name of Herb Pennock.
Right.
My grandfather and Herb Pennock were really close friends. Herb Pennock lived in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, which is just up the road here from Wilmington, and the suburb of Montchan in Delaware, where I live. And Herb Pennock was the general manager, and a great person and baseball guy. He's in the Hall of Fame, and he really got things started. And as you know, the Phillies had a good run there in 1950. It didn't end up, they lost to the Yankees and all, but no, that's where it all started. And my father, like I said earlier, was more of a football guy, but he really became involved with baseball and passed that on, and I was very fortunate to be in the position I was in, and he passed the reins to me, and I had some really good people that worked for us. You remember Dallas and Paul Owens, Bill Giles, who handled most of the off-the-field activities, and did a lot of evaluation on the scouting force that we inherited back in the early 70s, and got things straight, and I guess the rest is history.
Well, you grew up with the Phillies. I remember you once told me that your father made sure you knew what it was to work at the grassroots of the ball club growing up. But you went away to Yale with the idea of going on to law school. Well, you joined the Phillies. What changed your mind?
Well, I don't think I'd have made a very good lawyer, to be honest with you. But
really? Why?
I really got involved, started to love baseball more. I had the privilege at Yale to play both football and baseball, but our baseball coach was a gentleman by the name of Ethan Allen. And you do the research on Ethan, and you'll see he had a very good major league career. I think he's a career 300 hitter. Mm-hmm. And he was our coach at Yale in baseball, and he really got me involved, and I just started to, this is something I want to do for the rest of my life or my career. And to work with my father, and as we say, the rest is history, and I'm just very fortunate to be in the position I was in as the owner's son.
Mm-hmm. Now, after you formally joined the Phillies staff in 1963, you did your apprenticeship under quite a mentor, Paul Owens, the farm director. And Owens developed the nucleus of young players who would make the Phillies perennial contenders in the mid to late 70s. They were players like Larry Bowa, Greg Luzinski, Bob Boone, and Mike Schmidt. Tell us about the Pope. What kind of guy was he?
I got to actually make sure I get my years straight. I think it was the spring of '64.
Okay.
After I got out of school, I did a little bit of graduate work at the University of Delaware, and I assisted Tubby Raymond was the baseball coach. And in the fall of '63, I went to work for the Phillies. And in the spring of '64, I went to the minor league training camp. In those days, we had a camp. AA and AAA players were in Dunedin, Florida, which is a suburb of Clearwater. But the lower A club, Class A teams, were all in Leesburg, Florida, which is, in those days, it was really out in the boondocks of Florida. And that's where I met Paul. He was a scout. At that time, he was a scout for the Phillies in Southern California. But Paul was the camp coordinator. And we had, well over 100 kids, players. And that's where I got to meet Paul. And we weren't very good in those days. The players that had been signed, and this was before the draft, really, overall, they weren't that talented. And he and I spent a lot of time together, talking at night after everyone had gone to bed, and about what we really needed to get the ball rolling. And I got him, convinced my father that we needed to bring Paul in to be the farm director, and we had to revitalize our scouting force. It was a very difficult position because a lot of the scouts that we had to, fire, I guess you could use that term, were older fellows that I had known ever since I was, a child, like 10 years old. Mm-hmm. Some of these guys, we had to call them in and talk to them and say, we're sorry, we're going to make a change. And we did those things, and were able to revitalize our scouting and sign better players. And then, unfortunately, the draft kicked in,
right,
which is still in effect today. But I always sort of wish that we could have had about 10 years to operate under the old rules where there was no draft system. Once we got our scouting force realigned or revitalized, I would have loved to have had the open market for 10 years, but it didn't happen, and the rules are the rules, and the draft system's still in effect. There have been some slight modifications, but overall it's still, the system is the way it is.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned 1964, and that was my introduction, my personal introduction, not only to Major League Baseball, but Phillies baseball. And as memorable a year as that was, we're not going to go there. We're not going to touch that right now.
I remember they even had the tickets printed.
Yep.
They even had the tickets were printed. And when we were eliminated at the very end, when we lost out, we had all these tickets, and my mother wallpapered one of the bathrooms down in the basement of our house with these tickets, leftover tickets from the World Series.
Oh man, what a wonderful sense of humor she had. Well, look, we're not going to
think it was so funny at the time, nor did my father, but
well, she put it in perspective. She put it in perspective. So it's good that you had her around. We're going to fast forward, though. With this show, with this podcast, had several 1964 Phillies on it, and we've relived that. So we're going to fast forward to 1971. And that was actually your father's last season as principal owner and president of the Phillies was 1972, but he went out with a bang because in 1971, then general manager John Quinn, after the season, traded Rick Wise to the St. Louis Cardinals for Steve Carlton. And in 71, Carlton, then 26 years old, had gone 20-9 for the Cards, who were, Cardinals were a winning organization. Wise, who was then 25, had gone 17-14 with the Phillies, which is very impressive given that the Phillies were a losing organization at that time. Wise had also thrown a no-hitter against the Cincinnati Reds that season, and he'd also been the fair-haired boy of the Phillies pitching staff, a bonus baby who signed in 1964 and had shown consistent improvement. So at that point, the two pitchers seemed to be about the same in terms of talent. Why make that trade? Why did John Quinn make that trade?
Well, we were all involved in making that decision. I mean, Mr. Quinn was the general manager, of course, but all our farm system, all our player personnel people, Paul and Owens, myself, and some of our other folks all strongly recommended that we acquire Steve Carlton. With no disrespect to Rick Wise, I think time has proven that was obviously the right choice to make. And as you know, Steve went on and he became one of the great pitchers in the history of baseball. And we all remember that great performance in 1972. I think we won 59 games, and Carlton won 27 of the 59 games he won with a last-place ball club.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about Carlton. What was so attractive to the Phillies organization about his background? Because when Carlton was traded, he actually called Gussie Busch, who the owner of the Cardinals, who apparently he had a salary dispute with, and begged him to come back to St. Louis. So tell us first what was so attractive about Carlton to the Phillies, and then again, why was he so extremely successful in Philadelphia?
Well, Steve Carlton had outstanding, well, you use the term stuff. His slider was probably, at that time, the most unhittable pitch maybe in all of baseball. The break, the velocity that he could, and the break on his slider, the changing of the planes, and then you mix that in with a 93 or 4 mile an hour fastball, and there you have it. I mean, that was he was absolutely dominating. And who was it? Willie Stargell,
right?
Who made the statement? Of course, he's a left-handed hitter. Carlton's a left-hand pitcher. Breaking sliders, going away from Willie all the time. And he said, what was it? Something about trying to hit Carlton's slider was like trying to
drink coffee with a fork,
or eat soup with a fork. Yeah,
yep.
That was the analogy he used, and it was that was fun to watch. I used to sit down behind home plate there with the ground crew when he pitched at the Vet, and you could really get an appreciation there, even though you're 40 or 50 feet behind the catcher, of what that breaking ball and trying to hit it. It was just something to watch, and we were just fortunate that my father and Gussie Busch had always been close friends, and I'm sure if Mr. Busch had called any other team in baseball, they would have probably dealt their top pitcher, or one of their top pitchers for Steve Carlton at that particular time.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned the slider. Clearly, it was the success of Carlton's career. In 1972, he threw it so effectively that he went 27-10 and won, I believe it was 47% of all the Phillies games that year, which is one of the greatest, if not.
We'll do the math. I think we won 59 games, and he won 27 of them.
Right. Unbelievable.
Almost 50. I mean, it just.
Now, we had Tim McCarver on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and he talked about Carlton, and he said, of course, McCarver was with the Phillies when Carlton came over in 1972, but midway through the season, the Phillies traded McCarver for John Bateman of the Montreal Expos, and Bateman closed out the season as Carlton's catcher. Now, if you remember, in 1973, Carlton went 13-20. 74 wasn't that much better. At this point, McCarver has been traded back to the Cardinals, and he noticed that Carlton wasn't throwing that slider. So the Phillies reacquired Tim McCarver, I guess maybe after the 75 season. I don't think it's any secret that Carlton won his second Cy Young in 1977 after McCarver was catching him routinely. So that, talk a little bit about that chemistry. I mean, the pitcher-catcher relationship, and clearly with McCarver, who continued to be, until 1980 or through the 1980 season, Carlton's personal catcher. They became so close that McCarver once said, "When Steve and I die, they're going to bury us 60 feet 6 inches apart." Which is classic McCarver. But talk a little bit about their relationship. That really must have been something special.
Well, it had to be. Of course, I only observed. I wasn't, involved obviously on the field, but they had a very close relationship and a charisma. They thought, I guess, their thoughts were always, in this situation, what pitch am I going to throw? And Timmy would put the fingers down, and here it comes. But the pitch, that slider, it was such a dominant pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, a left-hander, his best shot was maybe to foul the ball off and just hope that maybe Carlton later in the count might hang a slider and the guy could get a good cut at it. But when he had that baby going, it was unhittable. And of course, Tim was a smart catcher too, and he knew when to call what pitch. And just that one pitch, like we've said earlier in this conversation, that slider was just dominant.
Now, were you part of the decision to trade for McCarver and bring him back to Philadelphia? Because, do you remember how that came about? Because Owens did bring him back, I think.
I just don't remember all the particulars, but, there were so many things going on and conversations with the Pope, and, it's really, it's 24/7. There are a lot of phone calls that are made early in the morning, and especially if the team's on the road and it's come to trade deadlines and whatnot. It's just, I really think though that anyone that in baseball at that particular time that had an opportunity to acquire Steve Carlton, they would have made the same decision. We're just fortunate that Mr. Bush called us first.
Mm-hmm. Now, you become president of the Phillies on November 22nd, 1972, at the age of 32. And it was a pretty, with the exception of Carlton, dismal club at that time. Your father tended to try to improve the club through trades, but you seem to have committed yourself to the farm system. Why?
Well, of course, by then the draft was in effect, the free agent draft, and it. When you make a trade, you're going to give up something to get something. But in the draft, it really comes down to the evaluation of your scouting department and, whom do we take and when do we take them. And fortunately, we made some good choices over the years, and were able to put a very competitive team on the field, and it stayed that way until we sold. Oh, I don't care. I mean, today your scouting has become, because of the computers and the technology, it's become a lot more sophisticated, but it still comes down to the judgment. What kind of information these scouts, instead of using pencil and paper like they did in our day, today when you do the input into your computer or whatever you're using, it still comes down, you've got to make a judgment. Can the guy do this or can he do that?
And that's a gut decision. That's intuition.
Yeah,
got to be.
Quantify, running speed. They put the stopwatch on the guy. You can quantify that, and you can run the 40-yard dash, the 60-yard dash. You can see the guy's time from home to first, and you can judge throwing arms. You can give a numerical value or a letter, whatever terms or whatever way you grade a throwing arm. But then it comes down, can this guy hit or not? And that's really what separates the men from the boys. And it's really tough to sit there even at the highest levels of amateur baseball and watch like the College World Series. And I'm sure there were quite a few players on both teams in the finals that were draftees, but you wait 3 or 4 years, and a lot of the guys that look good at this highest levels of college baseball, they're not going to make it in the big leagues. You're
right. You're absolutely right. Ruly, I tend to look at the sea change in the Phillies organization in that 72-73 period with the transition of principal ownership between you and your father. Your father promoted Paul Owens to general manager in June of 72, and Owens' almost first move was to fire then manager Frank Lucchese and name himself the field manager. And obviously that was a smart move because Owens needed to see what he had on that team, and he definitely did. That really was a turning point, the ability for him to see, as a judge, the player abilities. From that point on, did you set a timetable for the Phillies to make it to the postseason?
Well, I mean, there wasn't any written plan. I mean, we wanted to acquire the best players we could and just try to win. And of course, in those days, you didn't. If you won, you went right away. I mean, it was to the playoffs and the World Series. It wasn't quite as involved as there weren't as many rounds in the postseason play. There weren't as many rounds and whatnot, but a lot of the players that we were fortunate enough to acquire via the draft. I mean, I saw a lot of them play in college. I was fortunate enough to see Mike Schmidt play in college at Ohio University, and I'm just using him as an example. That was one player. He just happened today's in the Hall of Fame, and obviously he was an integral part of the success we had during that run.
Mm-hmm. There were two decisions that stand out in my mind that you made, however. In 1973, Richie Ashburn of fan favorite back from the 1950 Whiz Kids, was doing color commentary on TV and radio for the Phillies back at that time. Then there was Jim Bunning, who was, I believe, a pitching coach in the minor league organization, maybe manager at Eugene at the time, and Danny Ozark of the Dodgers. Those were the three considered to become favorites to become the next manager of the Phillies. Ozark was your decision, as I understand it. Why?
Now, I think with the young players that we had at that time, I just felt that Danny was low-keyed enough, kind of like a father would be with a young child. That might not be a good analogy, but he was at that particular point in time where I just felt that he would been the ideal fit for a young ball club with guys that are just really starting with their big leagues, and then you mixed in a few of the veterans and whatnot. But no, Danny did a great job for us at that particular point in time, and I'll always be indebted to him.
Mm-hmm. The other decision that I understand you were responsible for, because Owens wanted to make this trade, and actually for our young listeners, Owens made some unbelievable trades here. Just to run down some of the top ones, pitcher Ken Brett to Pittsburgh for Dave Cash, who became one of the first veteran leaders of those young Phillies. Outfielder Del Unser, catcher John Stearns, and pitcher Max Scarce to the New York Mets for Tug McGraw. McGraw became the closer of the 1980 Phillies. First baseman Willie Montanez to the San Francisco Giants for Gary Maddox, the center fielder known as the Secretary of Defense, who was part of that glorious run from 1976 on. Catcher Jim Essien and outfielder Barry Bonnell to Atlanta for Dick Allen, bringing Allen back home to Philadelphia, and catcher Johnny Oates. Outfielder Jerry Martin and catcher Barry Foote for second baseman Ted Sizemore. To the Cubs for second baseman Manny Trio, outfielder Greg Gross, and catcher Dave Rader. But what about the famous trade that was never made? I understand that would have been Tug McGraw and Bate McBride for Sparky Lyle, reliever Sparky Lyle, at the winter meetings of 1979. Why wasn't that trade made?
Oh, boy, you're really testing my memory.
That can't be too far of your memory, because that was your decision. Pope wanted to make that trade, and you nixed it.
Well, Pope and I were real close, and there were several other situations that came up where he wanted to do something, and I just said, Paul, coming from being the owner, I just said, well, we're not going to do it. I can tell it now, but we had a little set to it one time at one of the winter meetings. I forget, I can't remember the exact year, but he wanted to trade Bob Boone for Bill Freehand.
Right.
At the end of Bill Freehand's career, and I just said, Paul, we ain't going to do it. Boone's on his way to becoming a damn good major league catcher, and
right.
We're just not going to do it. And I know Bill Freehand had some good years in the big leagues, but it's just those kind of decisions are made every day at the professional level, where ownership and I'm sure the general managers and the scouting department, where there might be a little conflict in opinion or difference of opinion, but if you're the owner, that's your right to overrule your field people, and I rarely ever did that, or I wouldn't do it unless I had pretty solid reasons for going against the judgment of your field personnel.
Well, you know what? It all comes down, again, it all comes down to gut instinct. You were an owner that was raised inside that organization from the time you were a kid. And you had a gut feeling. And you were right. If you did the numbers, Lyle was a better reliever than Tug McGraw at that period of time. But Tug McGraw was really a major reason he had such a wonderful August and September of 1980 was a major reason the Phillies got where they did and closed it out. Bake McBride, next to Schmidt, had, I think, the best postseason of any of the hitters on that team. Without those guys, I don't think you win the World Series in 1980. And it's that kind of gut instinct and intuition that, frankly, a lot of front office people just don't have, never had in some cases, and even now, a lot of people in baseball operations, they're whiz kids in terms of analytics, but they don't have that kind of intuition. And in the end, that's what prevails. And I think that says a lot for the way the organization was run when you were the president. And like your father, you had the reputation of a player's owner. Yet, obviously, you came from a privileged background that in other cases doesn't lend itself easily to a sympathetic relationship with the players, many of whom come from much more modest circumstances. But what I've heard from so many of the players that were in Philadelphia during your time, it was like a family. And it wasn't just the players either. It was the concession people, the grounds crew, who really, really not only liked you, but more importantly, trusted you. How did you cultivate that?
As I think I said earlier in this conversation, I used to sit at Veterans Stadium behind home plate. There was that plexiglass door. It was like a sliding door. It opened like barn door, I think. And I used to sit there during the games with the ground crew guys.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could see much better there about the pitches, the location than you could sitting up in the 400 level in those executive boxes. And I had a lot of enjoyable time sitting there behind the glass with the ground crew, and they'd be yelling. Of course, the umpires couldn't hear you, and they'd be yelling at the umpire when they thought he blew a ball strike call. And it was classic years. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I think it's really a testimony, though, when a Hall of Fame player like Mike Schmidt and a grounds crew guy like Froggy, Mark Carfagno, talks so highly about you because players just, especially during the time you were in the business, so to speak, they didn't talk that way about owners. So I think that's a real testimony to the way you ran the club. Just a couple more questions for you. It's a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. The Philadelphia press was always hard on the Phillies, especially back in the 60s and 70s with writers like Bill Conlon, Larry Merchant, and Stan Hochman of the Daily News. Ruly, how did you handle the press?
Well, I wouldn't say I did a very good job of handling the press. I tried to be fair and answer their questions, but when I thought they were being unfair to the Phillies, to our ball club, I'd let them know about it. And we were winning on the field, which always helps. Gives you a little, you're coming from a position of strength. But, I just tried to be fair, and sometimes we had differences of opinion, especially with the Daily News guys. But then you start talking about, Ray Kelly, Alan Lewis, and Frank Dolson, those kind of guys. There was never any problem with them. And when they criticized you, those folks, you deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
Had no problem whatsoever with them.
This is probably the toughest question, and I know you'll answer it diplomatically, so I'm going to ask it. Did you ever have a favorite, or who were your favorite Philly players?
Oh, well, it's hard. I mean, there are people that your tendency is to go with the guys that were the most to like the people that were maybe the most successful on the field. But I would have to say I really Larry Bowa was always one of my favorite players. I respected him. He wasn't the most. He's one of the best fielding shortstops in the history of baseball. But he really, he didn't have one outstanding tool. I mean, he didn't at the plate. He wasn't a home run guy. He had a quick release, but he didn't have the strongest arm from deep in the hole. He could run. He was a switch hitter, but the guy just fought tooth and nails. He was just a tough kid. And he really, really enjoyed it. That story I always tell about Bowa, the first professional baseball game he ever played in, I think it was in 64. I can't remember the exact date, but we broke spring training, the minor league teams, and we sent him to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And the Mets had a farm team over in Greenville, South Carolina. Well, Bowa's first professional baseball game was against the Greenville Mets. Well, guess who was pitching for the Greenville Mets?
Nolan Ryan or Tom Seaver?
No, it was Nolan Ryan. And
okay.
Ryan that night, and there were bad lights. I mean, in that Western Carolina league, hell, you couldn't see anyway. But under bad lights, his first experience in professional baseball was against Nolan Ryan. And Ryan
was wild. He was wild when he was young.
And he struck out. Ryan struck out 21 of the 27 guys he faced. He struck out. And Bowa went up to the manager after the game and said, "I quit." He said, "I'll never be able to hit these guys if this is." And Bob Wellman was the manager. Bob Wellman calls me like at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Bowa wants to quit." And he started laughing, and Nolan Ryan just happened to be the pitcher, and he's the all-time strikeout leader.
Wow. Well, I could see the
history of
intimidation.
baseball, but Bowa thought every pitcher was going to throw like that. That'd be a rough way to break in under bad lights facing him.
Wow. Great story.
I love. He went on to become a hell of a player. But,
he did. Why replace Danny Ozark in midseason of 1979 with Dallas Green and not Paul Owens?
The Pope, I guess, in those days, he's getting up there a little bit in age then, and
I think he wanted it. I think he wanted it, though.
Well, I decided to go the other way, and it was a tough situation. Things weren't going the way we wanted, and we just needed somebody to shake the joint up a little bit. And you know how Dallas can get when he got his hander up, and he could yell and scream, and I just felt that's what we needed at that point in time.
For the younger listeners, the Phillies had invested a lot of money in free agent Pete Rose. Prior to that 1979 season, they picked up Manny Trillo from the Cubs, and you still had the core together: Mike Schmidt, Larry Bowa, Greg Luzinski, Bob Boone, and the team was not delivering. And Dallas Green came in, much like the Pope did in 1973, with the impression of, this is your last chance, guys. if you don't do something, we're cleaning house. And the Phillies, the core had the reputation of prima donnas at that period of time. And I'd have to say everybody credits Pete Rose for the inspiration, and I'm sure it was the on-field inspiration. But Dallas and his gruffness and his very candid way of expressing his discontent really was, I think, a major reason, every bit as much as Rose, for that championship. Would you agree?
I couldn't agree with you more. They used behind his back, they used to call him Whispers. Because, when Dallas got mad and he could yell and scream and the players would call him Whispers behind his back. Oh, boy.
Wow. What were some of the highlights of that 1980 season for you, Ruly?
Well, the obvious highlight was winning the World Series. And,
yep.
All the years of frustration and we'd never won one before. And finally it was achieved, and thank God my father was still alive at that point. And that just the ultimate, and it's just unfortunate there couldn't have been more while we owned the ball club, but it was a great experience.
Why did you sell the Phillies after 81?
Well, you can read all you want to about how much money my family's meant to have and so forth and so on, but it just got to the point where, as a single family ownership, we didn't think we could hang in there and slug it out with these clubs. Now are becoming more and more, with multiple ownerships, and it just got into a bidding contest on a lot of these players, and we just didn't think that financially it would have been in our best interest if we were going to say a single ownership.
Right.
And I didn't want to get in a position where you have to have multiple owners, and every time you want to make a trade or do a major signing, you'd have to call all your people, fellow owners, together and say, do you think we ought to do this? Should we do that? I didn't want to have to go through that, so we sold.
Do you miss it?
Well, I don't miss, that inevitable haggling that you're going to have with the players and their agents today over the money issues, and you miss the game itself, especially the player development end of it.
Right.
I still have a few scouts that I see occasionally, like at the University of Delaware, guys I knew from years ago, and get a chance to talk to them. I mean, it's still, that part of the game is player development is still enjoyable, even if you're not involved anymore. Just being close to it and seeing the old scouts come around and that kind of thing. But no, I just hope that things go well for them this year. So far, so good. They're hanging in there.
Yep. Well, hopefully we'll have a third glory era. Listen, thanks for being with us, Ruly, and thank you for making my boyhood such a wonderful one with the Phillies. I mean, I followed those teams like white on rice, and it was clearly a highlight of my boyhood, and capped off in 1980, my senior year of college, when the Phillies took it all. And I, in many respects, over my writing career, I've lived the dream by getting to know guys like you and Mike Schmidt and Greg Luzinski and especially Tug McGraw, become friends, and that means a lot. That really means a lot.
Well, I appreciate it, and I enjoyed the conversation we've just had. It brings back some fond memories.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.